Welcome to English Through History. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe. It helps us to create more content and it shows us we're moving in the right direction. We hope you enjoy today's episode. In the early 17th century, a scandal rocked the Kingdom of Hungary. Allegations of sadism, murder, and torture led investigators to uncover a number of dead bodies in and around the properties of a noblewoman, Elizabeth Bathory. Even more shocking was that the allegations accused Elizabeth herself as the mastermind behind the murders, indicating she took delight in the cruelty and killing of hundreds of young girls in her employ. In today's episode, we will examine the history of Elizabeth Bathory, sometimes known as the Blood Countess, and one of the first recorded female serial killers. We'll look at her background, the politics of the time, the crime itself, and the legend that grew from this event. As always, we'll look to dispel any myths. Born on August 7, 1560, into the esteemed Bathory family in Hungary, Elizabeth grew up in a world of privilege and power. Her family contained bishops, prime ministers, king, and esteemed warriors. At the age of 15, she was married off to the son of a baron, who later became a prominent commander against the Ottoman forces. They had children, and as shown by the legal records of the time, she was a prominent financier of the war effort, a patron for her servants, often writing on behalf of them. She was also a fan and a patron of the arts and literature. The politics of the time were complex. The Kingdom of Hungary had been taken over by the Austrian Habsburgs, but were also facing encroachments by the Ottoman Turks. The kingdom itself was multi-ethnic, but also multi-religious. Various types of Christianity were present, due in part to the European Reformation, but there was also a type of ancient paganism that was still practiced by the peasants. The crime itself started with the disappearance of servant girls between the ages of 11 and 14. It's important to note that at this time, feudalism was the societal practice, and so peasants, known as serfs, would work the land and were beholden to the aristocracy. They were basically slaves with limited rights of their own, often having to ask permission to marry, carry weapons, etc. They were completely tied to their rulers. Rumors of Elizabeth's brutality began to circulate, and as more and more young girls went missing, the whispers grew louder. The accusations of her sadistic acts were truly horrifying. It is said that she would bathe in the blood of her victims, believing it would preserve her youthful appearance. She would also allegedly subject her victims to extreme forms of torture, including burning, biting, and mutilation. As the number of missing girls increased, so did the pressure on the Bathory family. The authorities could no longer ignore the accusations, and eventually, when they entered the castle, they were shocked to discover numerous dead bodies in various states of mutilation and with no apparent view to hiding the crimes. In the early 1600s, a trial was held. Elizabeth's accomplices, including her servants, were interrogated and tortured. The testimonies revealed a web of cruelty and violence, implicating Elizabeth as the mastermind behind the atrocities. Over 300 testimonies were taken over the course of the trial. Elizabeth blamed her servants for the crimes, but no one believed her. The amount of evidence was overwhelming, and it would have been impossible for someone in her position to be oblivious to what was happening in her own estates. She was eventually found guilty, as were her servants. As a noble woman of influence, the authorities were at a loss as how to punish her. Eventually, she was imprisoned in her house and died 4 years later. Some later historians believe she was falsely accused. Her position and her influence meant many nobles and even the king himself owed her great sums of money. If convicted, her estates and finances would be taken away and her debtors cleared of any future payments. This was not an unreasonable theory, but the evidence itself doesn't really hold up to that being a factor. The overwhelming number of witnesses, the physical evidence found, and crucially, a very well documented and ordered trial means this conspiracy doesn't really hold much weight. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory has grown exponentially since her trial. Embellishments of her crime and the shocking nature of the evidence has led to mutations of her character. The interest in horror fiction in later years has helped to grow this legend. Novels like Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Grimm brothers stories all contain inspiration from this crime. For example, in the story of Snow White, the queen is based off of her character. The concept of an evil female aristocrat was a wonderful source of inspiration for many fiction writers. Her connection to vampirism came in the 1930s. False accounts from her trial stated that she bathed in the blood of virgin girls in order to remain youthful, but there are actually no accounts that actually mention this. The fact that most of her victims were young females probably gave rise to this conception, but the likelihood was that most of her servants would have been young girls, so it was more likely a matter of convenience rather than choice. There were many myths around Elizabeth Bathory, so let's explore the most prevalent. The first one is that she killed over 600 young girls. The reality is all her victims were young girls, but the exact number is unknown. The number 600 came from a testimony from a child that stated that figure and claimed that Elizabeth kept a diary of the girls that she'd killed. This diary was never found, and the number of bodies found in her castle were much smaller than this. Something between 60 to 100 is anyone's best guess. The second myth is that she was a kind of sadistic vampire who relished the torture of young girls. Now, obviously, this one is a little bit more difficult to disprove, and her mental state cannot be examined. However, from testimonies and accounts from her co-accused and witnesses, it appears that she would fall into violent rages in times of great stress and commit violence suddenly and without warning. Then she would ask servants to remove the bodies afterwards, quite calmly. As mentioned previously, any connection to vampirism came much later and actually has no basis in what was found at this time. So in summary, we know that Elizabeth was more than likely responsible for multiple murders of young girls in her employ. There's no disputing the dead bodies found on her estates. Due to the overwhelming testimony against her, she was found guilty. To this point, she can be considered a serial killer. At this point in her life, her legend grew on its own, fueled in part by popular literature like Snow White, Frankenstein, Dracula, etc. Her specific reasons for killing seem to be impulsive and without remorse, but not planned or calculated in some way. Her later characterizations, Blood Countess, Vampire Queen, etc., are all stemming from her fictionalized persona and have no basis in the reality of her crime. There may indeed have been a conspiracy against her, and like with any good conspiracy, it's almost impossible to disprove it. But by all accounts, the trial was fair, and there were extensive records kept that do not indicate any conspiracy at this time.